What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense and unpredictable stars, Nick Nolte, known for his gritty performances and volatile reputation, sits down for what should be a routine interview only to find himself under attack by daytime television's most relentless host? What started as promotional banter quickly spiraled into a fiery argument that Nolte did something unprecedented in his decades-long career. You're about to witness one of the most explosive and uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. Nick Nolte, Hollywood's most unpredictable and intense actor whose gritty performances and volatile reputation have made him both legendary and controversial, was about to face something that would push him past his breaking point. The seasoned actor who has battled his demons both on and off screen, who has spent years rebuilding his career and reputation, was about to encounter a host who seemed determined to tear down everything he had worked so hard to repair. For decades, Nick Nolte has been Hollywood's wild card. He's navigated interviews with careful restraint, handled difficult questions about his troubled past with hard-earned wisdom, and always tried to keep the focus on his work rather than his personal struggles. From his breakout roles in the 70s to his more recent character-driven performances, Nolte has shown that talent can survive even the darkest chapters of a person's life. But on this particular morning at the View studio, Hollywood's most volatile star would face a different kind of challenge entirely. This wasn't going to be about his latest film, his incredible range as an actor, or even his approach to his craft. This was going to be a calculated attack on his recovery, his redemption, and his very right to continue working in an industry that rarely forgives. What you're about to see isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is what happens when someone mistakes a recovering person's vulnerability for weakness, when a host decides that attacking someone's personal struggles makes for compelling television. The man who gave us some of cinema's most raw and honest performances was about to show everyone exactly why his reputation for intensity was both well-earned and completely justified. The View studio was about to become the scene of a confrontation that would leave everyone questioning how far someone should be allowed to go when attacking a person's recovery journey. The morning air at ABC's Manhattan studios felt charged with tension as Nick Nolte arrived, with his characteristic weathered intensity and guarded professionalism. The legendary actor moved through the backstage corridors with the careful steps of someone who had learned the hard way that every public appearance carried potential risks. His piercing blue eyes scanning every face with the wariness of a battle-tested veteran. "Morning," he said quietly to the crew members he encountered, his gravelly voice carrying just enough acknowledgement to be polite without inviting unnecessary conversation. There was something almost fragile about his awareness, like someone who had fought his way back from the edge and knew how quickly things could go sideways. His publicist walked closely beside him, her nervousness barely concealed as she clutched her notes like a lifeline. "Nick, remember they'll want to keep things focused on the film. Just talk about the character work, maybe mention how much you enjoyed the process, and we can be out of here quickly." Nolte nodded curtly, his weathered face showing the kind of hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving decades in Hollywood's most unforgiving spotlight. "Keep it simple," he replied with that distinctive rasp. "Talk about the work, stay professional, and get out clean." The makeup artist approached him with obvious caution, clearly aware she was working with someone whose reputation preceded him. "Mr. Nolte, just some light touch-ups to help with the studio lights." He sat perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested he was already counting the minutes until he could leave. The studio fell to a respectful quiet as Nolte made his entrance, his commanding presence immediately filling the space with an almost electric tension. The audience applauded politely, as if they understood they were in the presence of someone who demanded careful handling. He settled into the guest chair with the rigid posture of someone who was there under protest, his famous intensity barely contained beneath a professional facade. Everything felt appropriately cautious for an actor whose very presence suggested potential volatility. But Joy Behar sat quietly watching, her expression suggesting she was about to test just how controlled that famous intensity really was. "So Nick," Whoopi began with careful respect, "tell us about this new project." What drew you to this particular role? Nolte's weathered face remained controlled as he considered the question with that trademark deliberation that had made him one of Hollywood's most compelling actors. When he finally spoke, his gravelly voice carried the weight of decades of experience and hard-earned wisdom. "It's a character piece," he said with measured economy, his words chosen carefully. "A man dealing with his past, trying to make sense of where he's been and where he's going. Those are the stories that interest me now." The audience listened with respectful attention, clearly aware they were in the presence of someone whose every word carried genuine weight. His hands remained perfectly still as he spoke, every gesture controlled and purposeful. The director understood that this wasn't about spectacle, he continued, offering slightly more detail. It was about truth, about finding something real in the character's struggle. That's what draws me to a project these days. Throughout this measured exchange, Joy Behar had remained conspicuously silent. While the other hosts nodded respectfully at Nolte's thoughtful responses, Joy sat back with her arms folded, studying him with an intensity that seemed to be calculating the perfect moment to strike. Finally, after several minutes of respectful discussion, Joy shifted forward in her chair. The movement was subtle, but it immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Nolte's sharp eyes fixed on her with laser-like focus, and the other hosts grew noticeably more tense. "Nick," Joy said, her voice carrying a sharpness that cut through the careful respect that had defined the conversation, "I have to ask you about something that's been on my mind. You've had quite a colorful personal history over the years. The legal troubles, the substance abuse issues. Don't you think that affects how audiences see you in these dramatic roles?" The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Nolte's controlled expression shifted to something much more guarded and dangerous as he realized the ambush had officially begun. Nolte's controlled composure remained intact, but there was a subtle shift in his posture as he processed Joy's calculated attack on his personal history. His weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair slightly tighter, and when he spoke, his voice carried that dangerous undertone that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning. "My personal struggles are in the past," he replied with measured control, his words coming out slow and deliberate. "I've done the work to get my life together, and I don't see how that affects my ability to portray a character honestly." Joy sensed she had found her opening and pressed forward with the aggressive instinct of someone who had identified what she thought was a vulnerable target. Her voice took on a sharper, more confrontational tone as she leaned into what was clearly becoming an interrogation rather than an interview. "But Nick, don't you think audiences have a right to question whether someone with your history of self-destructive behavior can be trusted in these serious dramatic roles?" She continued, her words cutting deep. "I mean, we've all seen the mugshots. We've read the police reports. How do we know you're reliable now?" The other hosts exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing that Joy was crossing professional boundaries. Sarah attempted a nervous intervention, but Joy's focus remained locked on Nolte. Nolte's legendary volatility began showing its first visible signs, his jaw tightening as his famous temper started to simmer beneath the surface. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that suggested his patience was wearing thin. The studio audience could feel the tension building as the respectful promotional atmosphere rapidly dissolved into something much more personal and hostile. Joy's aggressive smile suggested she was just getting started with her systematic attack on Hollywood's most vulnerable recovery story. Joy's eyes showed clear satisfaction as she prepared to launch her most devastating attack yet. The pretense of discussing Nolte's work had been completely abandoned, and everyone in the studio could sense that something far more personal and cruel was about to unfold. "Nick, let's talk about what really concerns me," Joy said, her voice taking on a tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Your credibility as an actor, given everything we know about your documented struggles with addiction and mental health. How can audiences trust someone who's had such public breakdowns to deliver authentic performances?" The question hit the studio like a physical blow. The other hosts' faces showed immediate shock, and even the camera operators seemed to freeze. This was the kind of personal attack that crossed every professional boundary, weaponizing Nolte's most painful struggles against him in the most public way possible. Nolte's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The controlled composure cracked, replaced by something much more intense and dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor of genuine anger that suggested Joy had just attacked something sacred to him. "Lady, you're talking about my recovery like it's some kind of joke," he said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained fury. "You think addiction is a character flaw? You think people who fought their way back from rock bottom can't be trusted?" But Joy had clearly decided that respect for his recovery journey was irrelevant to good television. She leaned forward even more aggressively, her voice rising with what seemed like manufactured concern. When public figures have documented issues with reliability, when they've had multiple arrests and public incidents, isn't it fair to question their mental stability and professional fitness? Don't audiences deserve to know whether you're actually capable of doing the job? The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what felt less like journalism and more like a public attack on someone's hard-fought recovery. What happened next would become one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. Joy's attack on Nolte's mental health and recovery had pushed Hollywood's most volatile star past every boundary of professional courtesy, and the legendary intensity that had made him famous was about to transform into something far more fierce and uncontrolled. "You want to talk about fitness for the job?" Nolte fired back, his voice rising with an intensity that made everyone in the studio freeze. "I've been acting for 50 years. I've worked with the best directors in the business, and I've never let my personal problems affect my professional work. You're sitting there judging me like you know the first thing about what it takes to climb out of hell." Joy's face flushed as she shot up from her chair, clearly believing she could push the volatile actor even further. "Climb out of hell? Nick, you've had multiple relapses, multiple arrests. How do we know this isn't just another temporary phase before the next breakdown?" Nolte rose to meet her challenge, his presence filling the studio with an authority that was both magnetic and absolutely intimidating. "You think recovery is a straight line? You think people who've been through real battles don't deserve second chances?" The other hosts were completely paralyzed, afraid to intervene in what had become an all-out war between a television host and Hollywood's most unpredictable figure. The studio audience watched in shocked silence as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed. "Some people are just too damaged for Hollywood." Joy shot back, her voice cracking as she realized she might have awakened something dangerous. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become the most uncomfortable and personally devastating exchange in television history. The silence that followed Joy's devastating comment about Nolte being too damaged felt like it stretched on forever. The weathered actor stood there, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his decades of hard-fought recovery hanging in the balance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that unmistakable Nolte intensity that had made him a legend. "You just showed everyone exactly what kind of person you are," he said, his words cutting through the studio like broken glass. "You take someone's darkest moments, their biggest struggles, their fight to get clean and stay clean, and you use it as a weapon against them. That's not journalism. That's cruelty." Joy realized she had pushed too far, but instead of backing down, she made one final, desperate attack. "Nick, I'm just asking the questions that need to be asked about public figures who've had documented problems." "Documented problems?" Nolte's voice exploded through the studio with a force that made everyone jump. "You mean my recovery? You mean the fact that I fought my way back from addiction and got my life together? You think that makes me damaged goods?" He began removing his microphone with swift, controlled movements, each action a clear statement that this conversation was over. Joy watched in growing panic as she realized her attack had completely backfired. "You can't just stomp off when someone asks you hard questions about your past," she called out desperately, her voice now noticeably shaking. Nolte turned to face her one final time, and the look in his eyes was one of complete disgust, mixed with something that might have been pity. "Lady, Attacking someone's recovery isn't asking hard questions. It's kicking someone when they're trying to stay standing. With that, Nick Nolte stormed off the set with the same intensity that had made him a Hollywood legend, leaving Joy standing alone in the wreckage of what had once been a professional television studio. The silence that engulfed the View studio after Nick Nolte's explosive exit was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It was the kind of profound, uncomfortable quiet that follows a moral catastrophe, when everyone present realizes they've just witnessed something that crossed every line of basic human decency. The only sounds were the mechanical hum of cameras still rolling and the shocked whispers of audience members who couldn't believe what had just been done to a man fighting to stay sober. Joy stood frozen in place, her face cycling through expressions of defiance, confusion, and something that might have been the dawning realization of what she had just done. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its earlier aggression, replaced by something that sounded almost defensive. "Well," she said, attempting to regain some control, "I think that reaction shows exactly why we need to ask these tough questions about public figures and their reliability." But the other hosts' faces told a completely different story. Whoopi looked genuinely disturbed, her expression suggesting she couldn't believe what had just happened to someone who was clearly trying to rebuild his life. Sarah appeared close to tears, and even Sunny seemed shaken by the unprofessional attack they had just witnessed. The studio audience sat in stunned disbelief, many shaking their heads in obvious disgust at what had transpired. Several audience members could be heard whispering, "That was wrong, and he's been clean for years," their voices carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet studio. The production crew stood motionless, knowing they had just captured something that would be remembered as one of the most inappropriate moments in television history. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was the moment when someone's recovery journey was used as ammunition against them. What you just witnessed wasn't accountability or tough journalism. It was a personal attack on someone's hard-fought sobriety, and Nick Nolte's stomp from that studio wasn't just an exit. It was a man defending his right to second chances that will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. And that's how Hollywood's most volatile star went from cautious guest to defender of recovery in less than 20 minutes. All because Joy Behar decided that attacking Nick Nolte's hard-fought sobriety was more important than showing basic human decency to someone who had rebuilt his life. Nolte's stomp from that studio wasn't just a walkout. It was a recovering addict standing up to someone who tried to use his past against him. The question is, do you think Joy crossed the line by attacking someone's recovery journey? Or was she asking legitimate questions about reliability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more moments that show what happens when hosts go too far. Until next time, remember, everyone deserves respect for their recovery, no matter how public their struggles have been.